Yes, you can also tell him. So you can also tell him, Alex, you can also tell him, this is from Wes, that Joe Rogan and I, this is Wes. So this is what Wes said to me. Mm-hmm. You can tell him that Joe Rogan and I have talked about this.
I obviously haven't heard that before. I would like to know when that message was sent, because Joe Rogan did repeat the claim.
Okay.
Out of this 3-hour-long conversation, I'm going to bring to you 2 of the most important takeaway moments from it that actually gives us some insight on Joe Rogan's personal life, and also it's going to be very shocking because he may be in his private life practicing Christianity. Now, the center focus of this whole Wes Huff and Joe Rogan podcast is that of the great Isaiah scroll. And the mistake that Wes Huff made of saying that the Isaiah scroll is 100% identical to the Masoretic text. Now, Joe Rogan responded to this statement by saying, wow, that's a miracle. So what Alex O'Connor is doing is he's saying that if Wes Huff would have been a little bit more accurate with his description of the great Isaiah scroll in comparison to the Masoretic text, that Joe Rogan would not say, wow, that's a miracle. And also he believes that Joe Rogan would not be impressed. So let's dive into this, and we're going to see some very shocking reveals through this video. So let's get into it.
So if later on Joe said it was a miracle,
so he does say
I don't think it needs to be presented as a miracle. I didn't hear Wes presenting it as a miracle. If Wes presented it,
can you see how
I understand what you're saying. I understand what you're saying. Go ahead. So what I'm saying is, if Wes presented it as a miracle, maybe he shouldn't have presented it as a miracle. If Joe Rogan took it as a miracle, I don't even know if it needs to be taken as a miracle. But here's what I'm getting at. And you keep saying 93%. Again, Dan McClellan's mentor, teacher, who he cited, said 99%. Dan McClellan said it would have been okay with 99%. So my issue becomes, Alex, is
not that he would have been correct. Dan doesn't mean that he would have been correct. He just means he would have been okay with it.
So if the conversation goes 99% the same, greatest archaeological discovery ever, people were ecstatic, excited, this is revolutionary. Dan's words. These are Dan's words, Alex. He wouldn't have had an issue with it. I think the response to Joe Rogan is still, wow. I think the response is still the same. I think the information is still taken the same. And this is what I mean by we're splitting hairs over word for word in a conversational setting where, yes, again, conceded. He used hyperbole. He was in a 3-hour high pressure situation. He said he misspoke. He said he should have said that. And he said why. Now, does that change the impact of the statement? Does that change the reality of the statement? I don't think it does. And this is where I think, yes, Wes was essentially right.
Okay, a few things to say. The first is that you keep saying hyperbole, and Wes has said this as well. This doesn't strike me as hyperbole. This doesn't strike me as, hyperbole I think is defined as like an intentional exaggeration of affairs. So if he was intentionally doing it, then I think that's quite bad. At best, it's an accident. It's like an accidental hyperbolic statement, which is just to say that he was incorrect. Like to say it's hyperbolic might be that when it was 90%, he said it was 95. But to say, I think there is actually a category difference between really, really correct and completely correct, no matter how really, really correct we're talking about. Like that 91 to 99% is, significant in various ways, but it's a category difference to saying it is word for word identical. I think it was just a mistake. And I think I would appreciate if people, including Wes himself, would stop dressing it up in the language of precision or hyperbole and just say, it was incorrect and I should have said this instead. It's not unhelpful, it's wrong.
Okay, fair enough. So here,
Alex's main issue is that there are variants within the Isaiah scroll and the Masoretic text. And to say that it's 100% identical is wrong, because variants such as small word changes and differences and even a couple verses being missing between the comparison of them means it's not 100% identical. And Alex falls in the ballpark of saying it's probably 93% identical, and others say it's in that spectrum between 93 and 100%, but not 100%. So understand, this does not attack the core beliefs of the faith. It's just being more accurate and specific with what's actually going on. So Alex's main argument is, one, that it's not word for word identical as Wes Huff said, and two, that Joe Rogan thinking it was word for word identical is why he said it's a miracle, and that if he knew more accurate facts of what the reality was, that he wouldn't think it was a miracle any longer. But now it's time to see what Joe Rogan actually has to say in response to this, and Alex didn't see this coming. And also, we're going to see leaked, I guess, conversation that Ruslan is giving about the potential realities of what Joe Rogan may be doing within his personal life. Let's get into it.
And Wes has already said, technically, yes, I should have been more precise. That was the very first thing
you're
I
doing
said.
it again. You're doing it again. Technically, I should have been more precise. Why can't he just say he was wrong? I want him to say he was wrong.
So, Alex, listen very carefully.
Also, by the way, I must respond just quickly before we move on to this point. You say it's nitpicky, right?
It is nitpicky, Alex.
And could you say out of a 3-hour conversation, there's this one thing. This is the takeaway that Joe Rogan had from this podcast. This is what he remembered.
Okay, because he said it in the future. If he said it in a future episode.
And 2 days ago, he said that this is the thing that's been keeping him up at night. And do you know the reason I saw it? Because somebody clipped him talking about it on that second podcast and turned it into a YouTube short where all the comments are saying, praise Jesus, how brilliant the Bible is. This is obviously doing a lot of apologetical heavy lifting and is quite important for that reason. It's not nitpicking. If I'd have picked up one thing that Wes Huff had said that nobody remembered, nobody was talking about, and didn't have any apologetic relevance, then fair enough. But I've picked the one thing that Rogan himself has identified as the most important takeaway from that podcast.
Yeah, but you picked it before Rogan identified it, Alex.
Still won't say that he's wrong.
You can also tell him, Alex, you can also tell him, this is from Wes, that Joe Rogan and I, this is Wes. So this is what Wes said to me. You can tell him that Joe Rogan and I have talked about this, and he didn't seem to care whether it was 90% or word for word, that Joe still seemed to think that was a miracle.
I obviously haven't heard that before. I would like to know when that message was sent, because Joe Rogan did repeat the claim.
Okay, but he still thinks it's a miracle, whether it's 90%, 93%.
I think Wes probably felt bad.
I don't know exactly what it is that Wes will have said to Joe Rogan, but if it was before Joe Rogan,
okay, I'm gonna get you a screen grab. Can I get you? You want me to get you a screen grab of what he said? Yes, you want me to get you a screen grab of whatever he said?
All right, here's my guess: is that Wes honestly felt. My guess is that Wes honestly felt bad, especially after creating this big ruckus.
And he cleaned up his mess. You should be thankful for that.
It was like, dag, maybe I really got Joe Rogan on the edge here, thinking that it was a miracle. So let me follow up. So it sounds like he did follow up with them and then clear up. And then Joe Rogan was like, yeah, potato.
Which is how Alex, which is how the rest of us are hearing this, my brother.
Yeah. And Alex, I will say, I do understand your point. I don't think your point is not valid. Like I do think there's probably a sect of the population for sure that is listening to that, and that would make a huge difference. And they're probably people that think very similar to you and people in your circles. Like there is an archetype of a person for sure that that is really important. And I don't think you're wrong for that.
Yeah, we're not saying you're a bad guy.
I'm not tripping about that.
Yeah.
I totally get you. And I get how, I wouldn't say miracle. I would just say really good love and care for the scriptures and practices over lots of generations. Yeah. If it actually was word for word, I would be like, wow, that's a miracle. If it's 90%, I'd be like, wow, what great care for scripture.
Sure.
But I would so in that sense, I totally agree that miracle was a bit of a stretch and can be misleading to a certain sect of the population. It sounds like Wes Huff couldn't go back on the Joe Rogan podcast and clear that up, yet went back to Joe Rogan himself and hopefully, from what it sounds like, cleared it up. And
I mean,
it wasn't if it's the Joe
you got to
Rogan.
admit that's very commendable, right, Alex? That Wes
goes
to Joe in light of all this, cleans it up, and if Joe goes on repeating it, and again, conversation 90%, 94%, 99%, you got to admit that that's pretty commendable, and that he did everything he could to clear this up, and that's something that, man, that's awesome. Even though I still think he was essentially correct, and Joe Rogan thinks he was essentially correct. I think that's awesome.
So that's what Rogan had to say about the Isaiah scroll. And I also love the additional commentary that Ruslan and his producer gave further on this. And I would agree with their interpretation of it. But check this out about Joe Rogan's personal life.
But the idea that you said, I wanted to ask, you said, this is a big moment for us. It seems like Joe Rogan is sort of moving towards this. Yeah. Was there something in particular from the Wes Huff interview that made you think, Joe Rogan is receptive to this? What made you think that from the Wes Huff interview?
I'll be honest with you, and I can't say too much. I probably shouldn't say too much about it publicly, Alex, and I can share privately if you want me to. But there's there's private stuff that's happening. There's appearances he's making. Let me just say it that way. That people are reaching out and sharing, and that certain places he's popping up in that would seem to confer what we've been documenting publicly, that it's happening privately. And then the Wes Huff situation is just kind of the cherry on top. Does that make sense? I don't want to.
That's fine, but I wonder what it is about. The reason I ask, by the way, is just because with the public stuff, where you say it's the cherry on top, this is like, an outward sign that Joe Rogan is moving towards Christianity.
Hopefully, God willing, yes.
Is there something in the podcast, in the public facing bit, that made you think that might be the case?
Oh, yeah. I would say the past, 3 years of content and just his complete shift towards being much more friendlier to Christianity in general, much more friendlier to Christian guests, much more friendlier to the Christian worldview, consistently rejecting the atheist worldview, the naturalist worldview. Yeah, I would say there's been a lot of stuff that he said publicly. I can't give you quotes off the top of my head,
The reason I was asking was because if it was something specific, it's just earlier you were saying, for example, that bringing up the word-for-word identity is essentially nitpicking because it's one thing in a 3-hour podcast. But if there was something in the podcast, like if you'd have just said to me, like, well, when he seemed so amazed about Isaiah, then I might have pointed out that means it is actually quite significant and worth picking out of the podcast. So I wondered if there were things that you thought
there was other stuff. I think he seemed.
I think one of the most significant parts was and we talked about this a lot too, was regardless of Joe Rogan's faith journey, is that as Christians having, especially at the end of the podcast when Wes goes over the Sermon on the Mount, and so we have a real scholar, a real like biblical scholar, finally on Joe Rogan, not just kind of like an actor who's also Christian, a Hulk Hogan or whatever, talking about the Bible, but then also presenting the gospel, presenting the gospel through the Sermon on the Mount at the very end of the podcast. I think that's very significant. Is that like, oh, there's someone like really communicating the gospel from an intellectual standpoint and the theological standpoint at the end, and I thought that was significant.
When you say biblical scholar, what counts as a biblical scholar?
His private life seems to reflect what is openly being expressed by Joe Rogan. So what we're seeing is this evolution of Joe Rogan leaning more and more towards a biblical worldview. And what Ruslan is saying by the cherry on top is what he is seeing, and what we have even been able to witness is Joe Rogan is openly making expressions and statements about Christianity, and then you have people in his private life seeing him confirming what he's openly talking about and what he's openly leaning towards, which is the biblical worldview. So by saying it's the cherry on top, I wouldn't say it's the end, but it's like, okay, this moment, we can see that there's something different, and I believe he's going to continue to walk into this direction, is how I would interpret Ruslan saying that. Thanks for watching. Choose Christ. Be blessed.